human interactions. I'm going to say this, I think. Situating, I'm actually a PhD student, part-time at the moment. And the Asian elephant, and I'm working out of the critical futures field. So it's System 4 in the VSM language. But for various reasons in Australia, I ended up working with Professor Sahel and Nina Tula in the critical futures area. And so that's where I'm coming from. And I'm on my way to Canada to see my son, so it's sort of a stop-off. I'll quickly run through in 10 minutes a preamble, which will try and set the scene, and then the methodology, and then the results and discussion, which will be a sort of a staged theory design. So hopefully that'll work out. I'm not too sure how much people know about where I'm coming from in the futures field. But I think if I need to take time, I'll just shrink that right down and just give you the perfunctory dot points, and the slides will be there and you can follow it up. Okay, so the overarching framework I thought I'd start off with is called Futures Law, and it's really quite a simple thing. It's from Dr. Marcus Bussey, who happens to be my supervisor as well, but I'm not privileged because of that. It's looking at the blocks and the gaps and the friend equals the friends, or the leverage points in this. So for me, I'm looking at the language and how critical futures and critical systems thinking are actually coming from the same roots. I think critical futures is a decade or two ahead. That's just my point of view. But there's no issue there. There should be a common language in it. So the futures audit here, I guess, is, and I will get into this, is really about metaphor, auditing for metaphors. And I'll explain why when we get into the causal layer analysis, which is what Sahel talks about. So I know this is about Asian elephants and not African elephants, but there was just a particularly nice quote I found a couple of years ago, and it sets the scene for what's really required in terms of a policy, language-friendly, simple enough mechanism for research and policy gap to be managed. And that's so. In Zimbabwe, a quote was found about really relating to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's an economic equation. If you're hungry, the elephant it's pragmatic, viewable. If you're hungry, the elephant is food. Otherwise, at the other end of the scale, there's an aesthetic about it. And so I think that translates pretty well into the Indian and South Asian areas as well. And we'll use this at the end of the talk. There's two scales here. One on the left, the select and outrage scale, I've borrowed from a paper. I just can't find it, the chaos of my travelling. But I'll put that into the final draft. The Elephant Policy Index is really my own deconstruction of the elephants are beautiful index. It doesn't really matter. And by the end of the talk, hopefully you'll see that the pyramid there, the colourful pyramid, if you look down at the third layer, you'll see the blue. I would say that that's in the wrong place from an Indian Indic worldview perspective. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying there's cultural differences between interpretations of colour, and that can be meaningful. So the overarching thing would be how literate are we in the cultures that we're practicing or working with. So the complex problem in three pictures really is a matter of grinding away at the environment, what I call a corruption ink, but that's just a conversion of the wilderness, very sort of last century, going through a double bind, and this is the Gregory Bateson double bind, where it's not just a dilemma, but it's a dilemma compounded by the fact that the meta frame is incorrect and incompatible. And of course, escape from a double bind is the intent to get out. This isn't the focus of the talk. I also came across in my working years a thing called management fraud risk analysis, and it's just one of those areas, a Cressy from 1950, It's very well used, but usually chasing audit fraud in companies. The key point I'm bringing up is the triangle we use later on, but two of those points, the opportunity and the pressure, the bank manager with a gambling habit, are quite quantitative. But the capacity to rationalise is a cup of coffee and a chat, and there's a subjective opinion made by the auditor, and that has to be done. So it's actually a sort of combination of empirical and interpretive. The term I'm looking for is just reversing that process and taking this imaginary money. I did this slide a couple of years ago, the virtual money, and turning that back into the wills. And I think that's pretty much what's going on. The causal analysis I will actually get into and explain it. It's not very complicated. It's actually very similar to the soft systems methodology in terms of the three layers, the litany or the public disclosure, which ends up becoming the data that you're using in interpreting and deconstructing. The social systems area, which is the organisational structure, which is where I place the VSM and Stafford, a lot of Stafford's work there, and we're looking for systemically desirable change and the worldviews of the culture and the feasibility capacity. But it's really the layer 4, the myths and metaphor, where Stafford, you brought in the innovation, and that's where the change in the metaphor allows change in the other levels, or at least the possibility of it. So I've just grabbed a name based on some quotes that I found in literature. Gordon Pask is the science or art of defensible metaphors, so that's where I really began. And I was actually focused on the complex metaphor, not complexity. The complex metaphor as it is defined in mathematics, if you like, with the complex numbers. And that's the imaginary and the real, or as Gauss called it, the lateral numbers. So, and then up through Gregory Bateson, which is a paper I managed to publish, and a chapter in a book, which is over there if anyone wants to look at it. And then at the top of this is Margaret Mead's Inner Language, which all can understand. And that relates very quickly, very easily to about 2016, when some international policy and research publications were made, and they were talking about the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone needed between research and policy, and the intent seems to be that there needs to be more science and research getting involved in policy. The critical communication community concept comes out of Habermas, which is sort of going into a layer below critical systems and critical futures. It's a common group. And I think that's really what I'm hearing when I hear we need a community to do this, we need a community to do that. I'm listening to the word critical as a technical term from that school. The only other thing that I would say is that information and noise may depend on what layer of that causal layer analysis you're working on. And the total risk of communications, what I believe, or at least I'm interpreting it as being examples of what effectively the mathematicians call complex numbers. It's the inevitability of having to combine two incommensurate entities and factors. Now, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not there, but there are hazard plus outrage. In my working years, I was in a mining department in IT at the time, that they put all the mining engineers through a Peter Sandman course because people were getting injured in mines, and the engineers couldn't understand the political outrage that this amounted to. So there's this, again, combination of the social political outrage plus the empirical hazard and risk. The same thing in the book of John Simpson. I actually met John. He was a lecturer at the university at the time, and he did a similar approach with total country risk. And then I think we can just leave elephant country risk. I'm using that as a kind of metaphor. Just for the record, these are the previous publications leading up. I'm not going to go into it, but they're on the, if you want a 60-minute presentation, then that 2002 one I did for the futures profession. Right, yeah. So very quickly, and I'm not going to do this much justice, but in that blue circle is about half the humans on the planet, plus about 60,000 Asian elephants. Give or take, it's not really much, but certainly not more than that, or maybe 64. And the question is, how are they going to survive? And they're on the endangered list. They originally said to come out of Africa about 6 million years ago. migrated all through Asia, from Syria to China, but now they've basically retreated down to 13 range countries in South and Southeast Asia. There's 3 subspecies, and I don't think it's worth going to that, but Sri Lanka is slightly different, and the Sumatran elephant is now on the critical list because of the palm oil industry that's basically taking Sumatra and moving it. And the Indonesian government are quite uncooperative in NGOs working in that space. So within India, and I won't really go into it, but there are about 29 or 30 wildlife sanctuaries that the elephants are in. And so if you look at that map there, it's actually just those coloured spots. So even though there's 1.6 billion people, 1.4 billion people in India, only a very small percentage of those are actually interfaced with the elephant, the wild elephants in those reserve areas. And the history of those reserve areas were really based on the pre-colonial, pre-British colonial era, the kingdoms there. And the elephant was part of the military industrial system they had, so that they were kept. And the elephant is actually the totem for the symbol for that ruling class in the Indian system, in the farming system. Just generalising the problem, it's a situation that has endangered species, desirable solutions, which of course is better government, administration, and in a sense compensation systems. The cultural feasibility factors, which are the Indic or the Hindu and Buddhist. There are others, of course, I'm just wrapping them up into that. But that's sort of what some of the questions in the previous session were talking about. There's a rigid social structure, and within that, sense is made. The preferred future has a technical solution, so these are the 3 levels of critical. The VSM and hazard reduction I'm putting under the technical area. Its practical applications are in the participative action learning area, also called anticipative in the space I work in. And then the cultural emancipation of humans, which is all through the social ecological systems literature, but nobody's talking about the elephants as well. And I'll bring that up in the next, down the track, because there are stakeholders, tribal people in the south of India who hold elephants to be non-human persons. And so the question really comes down to, with all the talk about sitting around in the new participative environment, how do these 2 worlds come together? So very quickly through the history, this is a good book. There's been a war on with the elephants in the Chinese environment, and the elephants lost, basically. Elvin said, thinks that there was a mini cooling period. The elephants retreated, everyone retreated down towards the equator, but on the warming cycle they never quite got back. And the Chinese don't really mix with the elephants. They apparently like trees, but they don't like the forests and that sort of thing. So there's a gardening ethic there. So I think this is really what I'm looking at as a future of India and Indian elephant, is the double mind, or at least the complexity about the only reason the elephant still exists in the South Asian area is because of the Hindu and Buddhist ethic that is there. And yet that at the same time has a very stratified social structure. And the elephant is a symbol for power structures within that. So if there's a shift towards declining elephants, then it's an identity issue for India. The difference between India and China without elephants isn't much, and we'll get onto that in the next couple of slides. Just very quickly, 70% of the plantation owners in Thailand would just eradicate them tomorrow. I was surprised that about 30% of the population would agree with that. A recent empirical study, case study in India itself, showed about 50-50 at the farmer level. So we're talking about reasonably poor marginal farming and probably workers on farm tenements for land. They're the ones who really take the hit from the wild elephants, looking for food, of course. The Sri Lankan government did an announcement a couple of years ago about issuing guns, and of course they're part of the Chinese funding model now after their civil war, and that was very quickly pulled back with international outrage. So there's some strong NGO pressures working in this area. Within the Indian area, which is where about 60% of the elephants live, and about 80% of the wild elephants, There was a milestone report came out in 2010. Very little was done with it, but there was a key statement in there that that mass eradication of elephants within India is an ethical no. And so I'll explain what that means when we look at the Varnic system that's operating there. Okay, so very quickly, this is just a quick number crunch. Basically, any of the populations in the wild that are in the red, that half of the 13 nations, I don't think they will exist within the rest of the century. It's just part of the DNA diversity thing. The mammoths apparently were the last bits of the populations under about 300 or 400. They're not viable. The captured elephants, they're not called domestic, the captured elephants, they only live about half as long. This is the logging industry, and then they're unemployed, and in the tourist industry. But under stress, they live about half. Elephants normally live the same as humans. Pretty close. So under capture, they're dying from disease, and they don't breed in captivity. So there's no future there. So what we're looking at probably around mid this century, a population in India of about 1.7 billion, and probably around about 30,000 elephants. I'm assuming that there'll be some left in Sri Lanka and Thailand. So that's really the population, and if an epidemic comes through, they do get diseases like tuberculosis. And I think I've run out of time, so it's not going to be. So very quickly, this is more show than tell. There's a lot of symbolism in elephants and dragons and American eagles going on in the geopolitics. But what I was trying to get to is there's a hidden side and a not so much discussed side of India. Which India are we talking about? And so we look at the top left-hand corner. We get the typical Varnic system, the Brahmins, the priests. We get the warrior administrators, who actually are the power brokers. And then we have the business class, the farmers and the businessmen, and then we have the Shudra, the working class, if you like. Now, there's this here, I hope I pronounce it correctly, it's Lokiata, but it translates as the people. And basically, there's about 200 million, I think, there's 200 million Dalits or untouchables, and then there's also tribal groups that are all factored into the Indian constitution after the British left. But there is this rub, they're really non-people. So you've got this issue of how do you fit all this together. And that book, The Study of Ancient Materialism, I think is I stumbled on that, and it's a very interesting. There's also some recent literature from India and China, sort of, what's the common bit, what's common? And there's some ancient, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because how does a Western empirical scientist sit down at a table and talk peer-to-peer with an indigenous person who has, or anybody who has a completely different belief system? And that was brought up in one of the questions downstairs. But the thing is, before the Varnic invasions, there is this underlying layer of basically atheism in India. And that's where the Soviet-era Marxism came in. And there's quite a lot of literacy on that basis, which is really a hop, skip and a jump to the critical futures or the critical systems area in terms of social ethic. So that's there, and the prayer there is for food and nothing but food. And I think, jokingly I'll say, there's your research grant process. So quickly move on. I'm not going to get to the end. I want to get to the end because that's where the meat of it is. But Eleanor Ostram's socioeconomic systems model is very current in the human elephant area. Can it be critical? That's the question. And I quickly looked through it, and I think the coat hangers are there. Ostram's view is that the headline aspects or vectors can't be changed, but within that you can modify things around. So I would judge, I haven't done it yet, and this is where I'm trying to get the VSM sense of it. But certainly from a critical futures perspective and a critical systems perspective as well, I suggest there are niches in there for putting in dialogue and discussions to create a critical futures or critical systems elephant-orientated metric, which is a normative structure that people can then work to. And this model is a language through science research but mainly used in fisheries and forests and agricultural policy. So it's not, we're not going to get there right here. But I might just move on because that's, again, I was trying to get this complex metaphor of the reality of elephants, and this is where I became interested in the 1980s, visiting India, and then this projection into the mythology, and that's the Airavata, that's the flying white elephant, and that's Indra, which is the equivalent of Zeus flying. So look, I think we'll just have to skip through this. I'm looking for a tailored communication system. So the concept of gunas is fundamental to the Indian ethic, and black or blue doesn't mean a lot. Just means that red is active, saffron is the final kind of peace place, and tamas is the blues, the drag. So if we move on and just quickly say that colour here is, and I've got Vina and Stafford both talking about what is the difference between data and information, and I'm using the colour, I think the colour code works well. So there's some science there, we'll see it quickly. Stagecraft is an active theory where the lights come together, you get the spotlight effect. So it's really managing energy at an empirical level. If you want to work the other way, the computer printer works on a subtractive basis, but we still get the colours, and you end up with this 4 layers. This is the Venn diagram, which I'm associating with the sustainability model. So you go 3, 2, 1, and 0 if you want black, and reverse it the other way. So let's just skip this. There's no real anything there. I can't. So the causal layer analysis works on those levels of there's also a futures triangle, and in earlier literature about 2002, Sahel talked about the causal layer analysis model as a feedback loop, and a feedback loop on 4 channels, if you like. So you come in, you change the metaphor or the myth, and then how do you replicate that back through the system, back through the thing you change. So that'll be there. The science of that is covered by the metaphor. So if there's a flat metaphor, it's a dead metaphor, nothing is just part of the language. But if a real metaphor is found and it changes, something happens in the brain in the same way that our brain automatically converts the red, blue, or green colours into these others. So they're precognitive aspects. So, look, the stage theory is what I was trying to get at, and again, Sahel's come up with that. There was this is his more recent work, talks about social justice, risk mitigation, goes through directionality, which is really what I'm trying to pick up with, and ends up with a metaphor and a mantra. We won't have time to do that. That's the background for that. Now the results, I came up with about 3 areas where there were gaps. One was the field-related areas of praxis to do with what's working with human-elephant conflict. The second one is this issue about targeted or transformational knowledge, and I think this is really the key one. And then also this idea that there isn't much critical discussion going on, or dialogue going on within the social ecological systems model. And then you've got the stakeholder diversity, which we won't have time to do. So what I did was I combined the 2 areas, the inner and the outer, within this causal layer analysis. You've got the pull, push, and weight of the triangle, and you've got the sattva, rajas, and tamas in there. You can end up with a matrix like this. The colour codes are really what's showing. You can get some directionality between moving towards the green and away from the blue. If we mix the colours, we end up with this kind of combination, and I'm going around the top right-hand corner as well in a double loop basis. So it can be using as a kind of template to discuss depression with technology and how do you move. So it's a navigational tool in a sense. Let's just move on to the pictures, and I think that's the only one I'm going to get there. These are the disciplines involved in human-elephant conflict. This is the standard model. If we work around, then one of the complaints was, one of the issues is that these disciplines don't talk and work together or document. So later on, and I'm going to the second stage, which is the more recent literature, the last one, the IUCN 2023. These are the discussions where stakeholders need to talk to each other. There needs to be diversity, but no one's really, and this is in literature, no one's really explaining how that's done. So just some pictures from there. All I would point out here is that equitable, ecologically and sustainable are the three key words at the bottom of that there. This one I will stay with because this is the grounded, good paper and part of the book, grounded stakeholders in the south of India in the wildlife reserve there. There's an elite colonial era hunters club that's actually the British Raj, but it's also now the forestry department, which is responsible for the elephants and the parks and wildlife. There's an early planter group, and then there's just the tribal levels. Now this is where it's interesting because at this level, and I'm only saying what's there, what's written, at this level, their technology is to do certain rituals and go and talk to the elephants and tell them to eat somebody else's jackfruit. And they're happy with that and they can't understand why all the fuss is going on. Now, 2 decades ago that would have been dismissed, but the discourse at the highest levels of research and policy is get everybody together and talk, peer to peer. It's all very politically correct. It's just, can it be done? And is it meaningful? That's the question I'm sort of looking at. So in the end, I would be looking for key performance indicators which relate to these viable systems model within government departments in India particularly. They're still running off a 1927 Act, Forestry Act from the British. But I'm not criticising that, I'm just saying that's where the VSM comes in. It's like, what do they need to do? And in Australia we have the same kind of British KPI systems, and that's what tends to work pretty well. So we need this, but we don't need the language of the VSM, we need the language that policy people will want to hear. So just very quickly, there is this economic incentive and insurance issue coming in, because what's happening, if you read through, is that the conservation group domain are not particularly keen on compensating. They're conservationists. And yet the farmers themselves, who are actually killing the elephants because they're eating their crops, the main lament is that the government won't give them the compensation. So the issue is, if the compensation systems were to work, and we're talking about small pennies, probably green bank basis, I would just say half the conflict would go away, because that's just the way it is. So there seems to be some sort of impasse. We're finished at 5, okay. So let me just quickly go. There's a whole issue about what is systems knowledge, what is targeted knowledge, and what is transformational knowledge. And that's the paper I'm really working on. I'll skip all that. I think I'll skip that. That's just doing the VSM of India. Here's the viable system model, the way I like to present it without the hierarchical sense. We do a scan, we come up with the professors who won't talk to each other, we do an audit. The audit comes up with a view that there's something wrong. The auditor says there's a problem in this magenta-yellow, what we call interdisciplinary area. If the system 3 agrees and funds it, the little one, then the system 2 is in charge of organising these disciplines to work together. The auditor does another audit after some cycle, and if it's ticked off, there's a big tick, and on the show goes. The trouble is, well, if we're Indian, and I'm just hypothetical here, then we would have a steering mechanism with at the heart of it this 3 guna, this 3 system, not a binary system. However, for people who don't subscribe to that, the question is, well, what do you do? And then how do we go about doing it? So let me just run through this. This is the loop-back process, and I'm picking up on one of the papers, and this is the key slide I'm looking at. How do we jump from what I'm changing my metaphor, but we're jumping from like a horseshoe gap, a synoptic gap across from what is on the right-hand side, the futures action model discourse, but that's where I would put Situation and World Cafe and other areas. But the trouble is, how does this, it's not just a 3-day event in my view. I mean, that's probably useful. It's like, how do you keep the process going so that we end up on the other side, the green area, which is the, I think, I'm picking this, it could be others, but the ecological economic discourse, that policy will be policy friendly and will be what Margaret Mead was talking about, in a language that all can understand. So that's sort of, and I had in there transition through the SES, the Austrian world, but also going through that total risk analysis, so that it's not science, it's what the CEOs would say is, yeah, but so what? Okay, here's the risk, but so what? And the so what is, what are my voters going to do? And this is the problem in India. They've had several attempts at these milestone events. After the 2010 one, there was another one which was done through legal activism, and quite good answers came out. But the end was, nothing happens because on the ground, nobody can actually get anybody to scream. It's just, that's it. And the elephant, and it's about a 4-to-1 ratio. It's not huge. 100 elephants a year and about 400 people get killed. More people die from snake bite. But for some reason, it's charged up as an issue with the Indian thing. So this is a quick, it's busy, but if you just start from the bottom left-hand side at 9 o'clock, we walk around, we do a world view, we do a CLA, we do a little triangle, work out a new metaphor, and so how it is an iceberg thing. But we either keep repeating that with a kind of a black hole in there and nothing ever gets done, or we start walking up a bit of a ziggurat. We start going up a spiral, and I'm using the red, blue and green as kind of the primary disciplinary area. We get into interdisciplinary work with the green, yellow and magenta, and the sequence is based purely on the diagram at the top there, and we can end up with what effectively is white in the colour schema. So here, this is just done in a quick spreadsheet, but effectively, if we have environment green, talking to social red and economic blue, actually I would reverse those, but I've taken it, then we have a loop that says these groups need to talk to each other, and the result of that dialogue and discussion is equivalent to the magenta mixed colours. Now the question is, how do you get to the white? And this is where the problem is. If we're trained and culturated to just do binary discussions, then there just has to, in my opinion anyway, there just has to be an extra loop where we find out that what is the, actually that's turquoise, but that word is viable. That particular discussion needs to have some sort of interaction with social. So it's not a binary opposite, it's a complementary opposite, which, if we use the colour schema, says that it's the red that's missing in the other two. Now, I don't know whether, I think personally, I think of it more like species and niche. Some sort of dialogue has been created that is a multidisciplinary one, but has to be anchored back into the social and likewise, or it's the other way around. I can't quite work out where to go with that. But again, we end up with the scaling, we end up with some sort of metric and a policy decision as to whether it's tolerable or whether we monitor it or whether we do something. So look, I'm almost finished. Just for anybody who wants an empirical view of it, there's actually a black and white version if we just go down a level into the intensity. And it turns out that elephants are actually colourblind. They only see a shade of green. So, and some humans too, by the way. I had an example in IT, but we won't go there. Colour coding, and the person was colourblind and couldn't work it out. So this is a good metaphor, I think, because if you're trained, or if people are trained to see it black and white, there's still a dialogue possibility if we go down to a more empirical level. Now, those numbers I've used there are straight out of the science of advertising. The reasons you buy butter and something else. So it's not imaginary stuff. It's really manipulating the retinas of the eyes and all the engineering behind that to get you to buy that particular sandwich and not that one there. So I think this ought to be embedded back into the discussion of VSM. It's not like it's a VSM thing, but it's part of a language development that has nodes of concern about accounting. Nodes of concern about the future, concern about administration, concern about System 5 type discussions. And that's all you really need for humans to sit down and talk. It's not the VSM that does this, it's the humans who are literate in these areas. That's my talk, really. I thought if I had time I would run a little mantra back here, but...
you have the video?
I do.
How long does it?
3 minutes. Do you want to listen?
Do you want to discuss? Can we talk to you instead?
Yes, of course you can. look, I mean, the only reason I didn't just say why I put it there, because it's like I thought, oh, if there's no question and answers, it's because Sir Hale was my supervisor when I first started. There's a long story there. After the first year, he parted company with the university, and I had to find another supervisor. My supplementary stepped up to the mark, but we're still working together. COVID came in, and I went through a health crisis. So things stopped, and that's when I went, I'll leave for a year, and then came back part-time. So that paper that he published at that stage talks about that stage theory. So within the system, within the futures space, the critical futures, it's trying to move forward from what was an interpretation of action research, 2002, 2003, 6 vintage in the literature, which is about where critical systems is. You know, so it's not like it's vastly different, but they're not hampered by systems thinking. They call it post-structural. It's beyond systems thinking. Systems thinking is part of it, but they're not in. Habermas is one theme. Now we get into the complex numbers again. There's always two. It's Einstein and quantum. But Sir Hale uses Foucault's work. And so we have critical and Habermas going, these are the three things, technical, applicable and emancipatory. And then there's another issue that comes in as a second loop, which is the Foucault level, and I'm not an expert in this area, that says, yes, but you need to be emancipated from rational thinking. And that's the question. I have some issues with that too, I think. We're not all systems embedded within all systems. You know, there are limits. So.
Can I just thank you and say that all of us in the VSM community should take from that the lesson that the VSM needs to be part of a multidisciplinary understanding with multiple perspectives, multiple metaphors, multiple views, all of which share ultimately the same goals, but have different languages. And that's what you're talking about.
I think so, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, yeah. I think it's in the futures world, and there's three people now. There's Raymond Miller, Sir Hale and Roberto Poli. I haven't met him. They've all now got UNESCO chairs, and they're moving forward with the funding and things, and under the word anticipatory, which is, so you find the right metaphor, you mark it well, and it moves forward. So there's friends out there. I'm saying there's not much difference between critical systems thinking and critical futures thinking. It's just one's a little bit more advanced because they're not hampered by having to be systems. There's a beyond systems world, which is, they're political scientists and most of them. So, you know, and I think that's where the VSM community could learn something from. We just need a set of verbs, like Margaret Mead said, you need a set of verbs so that the system can actually talk to each other.
Can I add just a comment that you talked about the fact that to many people future thinking should be seen as radical, you know, very radical. In fact, Stafford in one of his books talks about the fact that when he was development director at the International Publishing Company in 1968, I think, he gave a talk to some of the directors on the board talking about the use of real-time computer terminals.
Yeah.
And they thought it was magic. They thought it was magic.
That's exactly
before the PC was invented.
Yeah.
Before, when we still had green screens and large computers, he was talking about real-time computing to the directors of the International Publishing Company, and they thought this is magic.
Yeah, well, that's what Jim Dator, who was a professor, is now retired, I think, from Hawaii, who was Sir Hale's professor, talks about that little quote I had at the beginning there. It should seem miraculous, it should seem strange. So if we haven't got Stafford was doing the job, presenting metaphors, presenting a language, you know, challenging people, and it would seem like it's crazy.
They didn't believe it.
Yeah. Well, then that's the futurist who's not a scenario planner, not a forecaster. I mean, they're all valid aspects of it. But this is the critical futures of trying to engineer new metaphors, and it is radical, yes, and that's why it's probably dangerous in some senses. Thank you for it. Sorry about the rush. It's on there. There's a 60-minute version on YouTube. Be the 28th person to have a look at it. But I
It's a day's workshop, but like what you've got there is just immense.
yeah, this is my problem. You know, there's got to be one point, and I just work on 3 for some reason. So bear with me. But what I'm going to do here with, I did it with Stafford, with Gregory Bateson, not because I couldn't do it with Stafford, but I just found that the mechanical metaphor of organisation didn't suit the ecological metaphor that Bateson was using. And so I went with that. And I wrote the paper, got it published through Jim Datel, and they said, oh, you've contributed to literature. So there you go. And I got it wrong. And it's a chapter in that book. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.